Okay, so I think we're going to kick things off. If people have had the chance to log into the mentee through your phone, we'll go through it again. We're going to be asking a series of questions, and hopefully if we can fit it in, we're going to have a little bit of a table exercise towards the end of the session as well. But thank you for joining. Welcome. So we're going to spend the next hour, or just short of, talking about workforce planning in the new era of work, or future of workforce planning, or future of work, or however you want to term it. So quick introductions. My name is Davinder Kang. I have Michael here who can introduce himself. We work in Deloitte. We're the UK leads for people and workforce analytics. If you've come to the conferences previously, you will have seen us or numerous members of our team talking and presenting around the latest and greatest in HR and people analytics.
So as Davinder said, my name is Michael Purdy. I lead the People and Workforce Analytics team with Davinder, as she said. My specific focus is around strategic workforce planning, and more recently, probably for the last sort of couple of years, looking at how you can start to do workforce planning in a slightly different way, which we're going to talk about a little bit further down in the presentation.
Okay. So, to get us all started and warmed up, if anyone hasn't, if you want to access the internet for your phone, log into mentee.com and enter in the 6-digit code. We're going to start off with just some warm-up questions to see how the mentee is working, as we'll be using it throughout the rest of the session. So if we go to the first two questions, just fun, light-hearted, just to make sure everything's working. I think the questions are, who's up to date on the latest Game of Thrones? And then a little bit of a simpler questions for people who don't know anything about Game of Thrones, like me. What did you do over Easter weekend? So, on the latest of Game of Thrones, do we have any fans in the room? Clearly not.
A couple of people who don't know what it is. This is good.
See, most people are like me.
A lot of people to watch it this evening. Something
Is that
to do this
because
afternoon.
people actually left their house the weekend and enjoyed the summer?
And a few people who don't know what Game of Thrones is, we won't be covering that.
It has nothing to do with workforce planning. Okay.
And the next one?
And then a little bit more closer to what we've been doing. How did everyone spend their Easter weekend? I think it's free text, this one, so we'll see a word cloud. Oh, that's nice. So I thought it was going to be barbecue.
There you go, barbecue, there it is.
Eating.
Eating chocolate, there you go. Okay, great.
At least none of it's work. That's always nice to see. Okay, so if we go back to our presentation. Thanks, Dan.
Bear with, we had some technical problems that we're sorting out
Right.
before the presentation.
Let's kick off.
Okay. No, not yet.
Not
we'll
yet.
get to that.
Don't get excited. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today. So 3 overall discussion points, and they will be discussion points, so there will be points where we want to actually get your point of view. But I'm going to kick off by talking about workforce planning today. So what are we seeing in terms of trends? What are we seeing in terms of what organizations are doing? Where do we think people are in terms of their workforce planning approach and strategy? How we're seeing it changing. So I'll be giving a little bit of a view on our latest Human Capital Trends report, which we just launched last week. So hopefully some stats there. And then Michael's going to be talking about how we, as Deloitte and other organizations we've been working with, are actually approaching this. So if you've been to the conference previously, I think we started talking about this a couple of years ago in terms of future of work and future of workforce planning, so to give you a view of where we're at today. So in terms of workforce planning today, so anyone who follows the Human Capital Trends report will know that Deloitte have just launched the annual report for the year. So the global one has just launched, and the UK version of it will be launching next week. It's a big global survey, goes out to business leaders, HR leaders across the globe, and asks them a number of questions to get a sense of what's really trending in the world of human capital, in the world of employees, in the world of anything HR related. So there are 3 big chapters in the report this year. One of those chapters is the future of the workforce, so very relevant in terms of what everybody's talking about. And within that, there are 3 key themes that are coming out, which are quite important when we start thinking about strategic workforce planning and how we actually start managing and being proactive in all of the changes that we are facing as organizations and as leaders. So the first one is around super jobs, as we're calling it, and this is the concept of actually augmenting humans with robots. So I think out of all of our respondents, and I think there's around 10,000 in total, 2/3 of respondents have established automation programs within their organizations today, and the range of these are anything from your general bog standard robotics all the way through to cognitive and AI. Now, what that means is that over 80% of these organizations know that as they're increasing their attention on automation, they are going to need to increase and significantly increase the investment in reskilling the workforce. And the whole concept of a super job is coming out and what that means and the impact it has. The other theme we're seeing is the rise of the alternative workforce. So we know that IT have always been ahead of the game in terms of hiring huge volumes of contractors. It's going outside of the IT function. We're seeing alternative workforces, gig, crowd, contracting being more prevalent across all of the organization and not just in some of the hard skills that we see. Now, what that means is that organizations know that they need to be flexible in how they actually engage an alternative workforce. How do they actually bring them in? And over half of respondents have recruitment strategies that are focused on alternative workforces and alternative workers. However, out of everyone that responded, only 8% of organizations actually have established processes to manage and develop alternative workers. So we're already seeing a distinct gap there. The final trend and theme that we're seeing in the future of workforce is around the 21st century leader. Leadership always has a huge demand. We're always seeing those demands changing. When we asked our respondents this year, what are the unique skills you want to see in your leaders? The 2 things that came out is that over 80% of people that responded wanted to see the ability for their leaders to really manage through complexity and ambiguity. And over 60% of respondents want to see leaders that have the ability to influence. So we can see that changes in the workforce are happening. They're increasing in terms of their complexity, and the demands in how people are expecting this to be managed and on the leaders are also increasing and changing in their complexity. So what does this mean in terms of workforce planning? So what we're finding, and it's probably no surprise, is that when it comes to workforce planning, strategic workforce planning, and being able to manage through these changes, is that we're still not very good at it. On the whole, we're still not really managing it through. We're still our biggest customer, so we are still using it mainly as HR professionals and not seeing a lot of business leaders really using it. The big questions that strategic workforce planning sets to answer around linking work to strategy still sometimes misses the mark, and now more than ever, there's a huge expectation on it to be right. Whatever number is presented is gospel. I don't know how many people in the room are being asked to showcase the benefits of automation within the workforce. So it's not going away, and it's getting ever more complex. However, we'll throw it out to all of you guys and have a quick poll on where you think you are in terms of the maturity of your planning, forecasting, alignment to overall strategy, alignment to operating strategy, skills mapping, and predictive modeling. So if we answer the next question on our mentee, we can see where we all think we are in terms of our own strategic workforce capability? Oh, wow. That's quite interesting.
This is really interesting. Okay, so we've got a broad range. Most people are filling into this sort of veterans. We've got a lot of people who have been doing this for a while. People with some experience. Okay. So I guess that is some context of sort of where you guys are coming from. If we move to the next question in this, what we want to do is really kind of capture a view of how effective you guys think your current workforce planning is. So as Davinder said, against the difference between the maturity of your planning, how strategically aligned it is it aligned actually operationally as well? Again, that's often something that we see. You can do a strategic plan, but does it link to anything in reality? Does it link to your operations as well? Is there anything in there around skills mapping, and how good are you at forecasting and predictive modelling? So just a quick straw poll of some perspectives on that.
Is this on a scale of 1 to 5?
Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting when we do this, because we do these types of surveys quite a bit when we're working with organisations, what we often see actually, which is really interesting in you guys, is that there's often this big mismatch between the strategic alignment and the operational alignment. What we tend to find is organisations focus down on operational planning and often miss the point of the strategic side of things because the burning platform is getting people on the ground and doing it. So the link between these two is really interesting. So we've got a very mature group in the room, so congratulations everyone. Although at the other end of this side of the survey, I guess, kind of skills mapping and predictive modelling, looking at what these things kind of link to, I guess the maturity of what you're doing might be, I guess, falling between these. We're going to talk a bit about how people are being asked to sort of predict the future and think about new roles and new jobs. And in context of actually thinking about what predictive modelling is, I guess thinking about where the maturity of that is in existing capability is often, again, a challenge when you're being asked to do even more with this type of capability. I think you want to add to that?
No, I think that's fine. So obviously a good way of looking at this is thinking about it in terms of maturity. So we can get pretty advanced in what we're doing when we understand the parameters of what we're working with, when we understand the parameters of what supply and demand is. What we've seen is when that starts changing and shifting, which is where we're seeing the trends go, which is where people actually are right now, we tend to see organizations falling within a maturity similar to what we've got on the screen right now. So when we think about strategic workforce planning and the maturity and the sophistication of what people are doing, we tend to see a lot of organizations at a particular stage on this model. Now, with the shifts and the changes in priority, that's having an impact on what the actual maturity model is. So if we think about what really makes strategic workforce planning successful in the questions it's setting out to answer, the type of analysis and data it's looking at, and the type of skills and capabilities that you would need to actually deliver on this, we're starting to see a big change across those three pillars and three elements of what makes this successful between the today and I guess the today, tomorrow a piece of it, which is moving away from just trying to understand where you've got gaps in skills and fulfilling and managing those to actually being able to scale and realize some of the benefits of disruption. What does it mean to have a workforce that is heavily automated or can be automated and shift down in the levels of automation? How do you actually navigate through the talent ecosystem that people have access to today? And the same with data. How do you move away from having mainly HR, organizational data that's financial, operational, to something that's more open source, like you will have seen in some of the exhibitors today and some of the tech showcases, the amount of open source data available to get insights that's outside of your organization is something that people are starting to feed into their workforce planning. And finally, what are the types of skills and capabilities that you need? HR have invested heavily in modelers, data scientists, bringing people in. But it's more than just that. How do you actually get people into wargame, identify the macro and micro trends that are going to impact your organization? How do you get the leaders that can influence, not just in HR, but outside of HR? And how do you bring in that data science expertise that doesn't see workforce planning as just a one-off project, but as a evolving and dynamic and always there element of what people do day to day in running the business? So ultimately, before I hand over to Michael, we're starting to see a whole new aspect added to maturity, and we've kind of labeled this quite candidly planning for disruption, which is how do you actually start planning for a future workforce, a current workforce, ever-changing and evolving workforce where the parameters are hard to measure. So I'm going to hand over to Michael now, who's going to talk a little bit around how we've been doing it.
Thanks very much. So, as Davinder said, I think one of the sort of key things that we started to talk about a couple of years ago was this shift from workforce to work. We kind of came at this from an angle of really the questions that we're being asked. Typically, when we're talking about workforce planning, we get a call from HR. What we realised was we were starting to get it from different places. We were starting to get questions from people in the strategy teams, in the IT teams, in the operations teams, who were saying, we've actually been given the budget to scale up some of the things that we've been piloting. We can see this is going to have a massive impact on the workforce, but we're not HR professionals. We don't understand how this fits with the way that people actually do their planning. So we actually started to think, well, you know what, this isn't really about workforce at all. This is about the work that people are doing. And then we had a bit of an aha moment. And again, we presented this a couple of years ago, which was really organisations don't have a very good way of talking about the work that they do. They're very good at talking about roles because we like complexity and we like to feel special. So we give everyone job titles and job descriptions and things like that, which makes us feel very individual. And we know that, you know, an administrator over here can't be an administrator over there because the job titles are different, and that's very, very different. Actually, the content of the work is potentially very similar. The subject matter expertise that goes on top of that, or the context of that work, is the thing which makes it, if you like, unique to that place, but not really the way in which it's delivered. So when we started thinking about developing an approach that would be strategic work planning, we realised that we needed to go back to the basics of this. The first thing that we started to do was actually think through a way of doing it, really. So this is just a simple three-step way of thinking about how we've done this. The first thing is thinking about linking strategy and work together. Again, this is something which is often overlooked when organisations are thinking about their strategy in the big picture. But when you think about your strategy and then you think about the impact on the workforce, thinking through what the impact of changing that work will be in context of your strategy is very, very important. And I've got a really good example that's come out in the last couple of weeks between two retail banks. And retail banking is an area that's going to have a huge amount of change going on. Nationwide, for those of you who aren't from the UK, is a building society. They're a retail bank. They've come out and they've said, we're going to keep our branches in every local location. We're not going to automate, we're not going to get rid of anything, and we're going to guarantee our customers that we're going to keep a physical location for our stores, for our customers. Another bank, NatWest, has been piloting automated customer terminals in branches for the last 2 years, and their strategy is going the other way. But the customer experience, the representation of that work, is very, very different. So thinking about how you actually link your strategy and the type of work that people will be doing is the first part of this process. It's a very important thing to think about. Do the changes that you make to the work that you do impact on your customers and therefore impact on your strategy? So how do you present yourself as an organisation? And taking that to its logical conclusion, as HR and talent professionals, how do you present work to people as a result of that? The second part of this then is thinking about how you can profile this impact. One of the things that we realised was that actually if we don't think about the work and think about the way in which that's going to change, it's very difficult for us to actually predict the future. I often get asked when I talk about these things, can I predict what the roles of the future will be? No, I wouldn't be here talking about this if I could do that. I'd probably be predicting lottery numbers or something. But really what we're talking about or thinking about with this is how can we actually understand what the impacts will be and then start to make good decisions about where those opportunities might lie. So we did a bit of thinking about this, and I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the work that we did with this, but we picked up some research. There was a lot of academic research being done specifically around automation. It's often something that's talked about a lot at the moment in this space, particularly in particularly in HR. But we realized that actually where people had started to do things like predict the level of automation impact on a workforce or on a specific type of role, we started to realize that we could take that quite a few levels deeper. We realized that we actually know a lot about these things. The future of work, sorry for people in the room, for me is kind of the future of nothing. We know all of these things. We understand a lot about what's happening here. So what we tried to do was actually build our own way of thinking about this analysis. So do we understand the impact of cognitive technology? Well, technology doesn't target roles, it targets specific processes and tasks. So if we can understand those and we can start to attribute things to those, then we can start to predict the level of impact on that work and therefore on that role. So that's exactly what we've done. And we came up with this concept of what we call the 3 dimensions of work. It's a bit of a consulting phrase there, but we realized that actually the changing nature of work is happening over 3 specific levels. The first one is physical proximity. So how far away from where work could be delivered does that person need to be? The second one is talent category. So what are the things that would make a type of work more likely to be crowdsourced as opposed to being done by a full-time employee? Because again, we can understand what the attributes of that type of work are, and therefore we can start to think about a structured way of predicting what that could look like. And the third one is, we must change this, but it says automation. It's actually technology. We know a lot about how technology works and the types of processes that, or the types of things that it's good at replacing or the things that it's good at augmenting. And therefore we can use that type of thinking to actually build a structured way of, or a repeatable way, if you like, of thinking about how each of these impacts will be felt. And the third part then is really when you get back into the basics of workforce planning, thinking about the economic impact of this, thinking about, if I've decided that I'm going to do that, is it actually cheaper to do something through a crowdsourcing platform than to do it through a contractor? And again, a lot of organizations don't understand that. They're probably still actually wondering whether they can use crowdsourcing rather than worrying about whether it's actually a more cost-effective or more sustainable way of thinking about this. So this is kind of really just our approach to thinking about how we do this new style of workforce planning. Again, I'm going to talk through something that we've presented before, but it's kind of a really interesting thing to think about when we're talking about how this concept of work fits with workforce planning. And as I said, when we really tried to do this with an organization, we realized that there's really bad ways of describing work across a business, across anyone. So we came up with a way of actually grouping and clustering work together. And we used some open source data and a bunch of other stuff that we bought from some of the providers that are around the world aggregating this type of data. And we developed our own, what we call work architecture, that breaks work down into 5 key components. So assessment, problem solving, production, communication, and supervision. Underneath each of those, there's specific tasks that actually fit into each of these categories. What we can do is use these to sort of build up what we would typically think of as a role. So describing work in a different way to how you would traditionally do it. But what that allows us to do then is have a common language to describe work. So we can actually describe different roles using the same language. And of course, if we do that, we can then abstract it again and look at what actually an organization is doing in terms of the type of work and the volume of output that it has. Now, the benefit of doing it in this way mean that we can actually start to think about where the specific, if you like, interventions that could be made can start to target specific types of work within a role. So if you imagine this is a sample role, these are some examples of things that might sit within it. We can now be very specific about what is targeting these particular processes and think about how you would actually adapt this. So when we're doing the planning process, we're actually being very specific about the type of disruption or the type of intervention that we're making at a, if you like, a task or process level within those job roles. But of course, that then leads you to see that you can start to look at what happens when you take that away. And you can start to look at what happens when you start to build these new roles. And you can start to think about what happens when you need to have certain other skills or certain other ways of thinking about it. So this is really how we've started to think through, if you like, a different approach to workforce planning. So thinking about it from the perspective of the work that's being done, with a common language over the top of it, thinking about specific interventions and ways of changing that work, and then putting that back together so that you can really look across an organization and start to think about how you've got these, if you like, common themes or opportunities. So you can start to see where if you've got an RPA project running in one part of the organization for a specific type of work, you can start to see where you can apply that in different places in other parts of the organization that you might not necessarily have seen before. So it's quite a different way of thinking about workforce planning. It's a different way of thinking about how you apply this sort of disruptive nature to an organisation, and it's fundamentally changed some of the ways in which we think about this. We've had to bring in some of the stuff that a lot of our strategy consultants use, so much more, as Davinder said, wargaming and scenario planning, thinking about designing the future state rather than trying to project and predict the future, and actually adapting to, if you like, designing what the work will look like in the future. So deliberately thinking about what work isn't going to exist in a role, and therefore at what point does that role no longer exist. So we thought we'd because we're getting you guys to do lots of stuff today. We've never done this before on the mentee thing, so this may not work, but we're going to give it a go. One of the things that we do in order to kind of introduce this to organisations that we work with is to play a little game. So what we're going to get you to do is just, in your tables, have a bit of a discussion. Think about the two roles that we've got at the bottom here. So we've got a short job description of a customer service representative and a software application developer. We want you to discuss through these sort of three dimensions that we talked about: proximity, so where does that work need to be done? The talent category, so who needs to do that work? Could it be done by a contractor? Could some of that work be crowdsourced? And the third one then around technology, so could you just automate some of the work that role is doing? We want you to kind of talk through and think through these questions. Think about how these roles will be impacted. Think what might change, what might not change. Like I say, have a discussion in the group. And then on the mentee, which we're not going to put on the screen, but it'll be on your phones, you're going to have 3 scales. And what we want you to do is essentially score them individually as to what you think the impact of those will be. So we're going to do customer services first and software application developers second, but we'll do that as we go. So we're going to also, at the end of it, kind of come around and get some perspectives on the discussions that you've had. So customer service, you guys kind of said that there's a big opportunity here to automate some of that work, different working arrangements, potentially through different types of contracts or different ways of working, and proximity kind of dropping in between. That's interesting. And again, similar score on this one for proximity, which is interesting for the software developers, because typically those are the things that we would outsource maybe or move away. Automation less, and working type, similarly contractors, things like that. One of the things that we see when we do this is it forces people to have a discussion about the type of work that people are doing and almost critically describe like what it is for us as a business. And maybe you had this in your tables. Unfortunately, we won't have time to go around and capture all of these things, but we have some time for questions. Maybe we can do that at the end. But the reflections that we get is that actually between different organisations, the ways in which they actually think about those roles, the way in which they think about that work is quite personal to them. So can we go back to the presentation, please? So, as I said before, one of the things that we've done with this is to, if you like, make this repeatable and structured. So we actually have now built a series of algorithms that will predict this for us. So we can take an organisation's data, we can take their job roles and their HR data, and we can predict the impact across these 3 dimensions. So this is one of the high-level outputs from that algorithm, if you like. So software developers have a high opportunity for proximity, less so customer service. Actually, you probably bang on that one. Automation level is lower, and talent category, again, is a bit higher for software developers. But what we can then do, as I was saying, is then take that a level further. And we've actually started to build down into the actual specifics of what this means. So we can now start to be very specific about the opportunities for RPA, cognitive, or chatbots within specific job roles based on the work that they're doing. So again, as you may have done in your conversations that you had in your tables, you start focusing in on a process or a piece of that job, and you start to describe how that role will change. Well, that's exactly what we've done with this. So you can start to directly compare where the opportunity might sit. I've deliberately not put any numbers on this and just kind of color-coded it rather crudely in this, but it kind of proves the point. If you were looking at customer services reps, you probably would want a chatbot instead of some form of process automation. Similarly, if you were looking at a software developer, chances are in the next 5 years, cognitive tech is going to really truly disrupt software development. It's probably not going to be chatbots. So again, thinking about this in a structured way, a comparative way, would you ever have thought to compare software developers and customer services representatives to then describe the impact of automation, proximity and talent categories, and actually probably then be able to have a very good discussion about what you would do with regards to automation in context of your workforce. So to kind of round this off, I thought I'd just give you a bit of an example of how we've done this with an organisation, so I'll give you a real-life example of this. We worked with a utilities company, and again, they wanted to do it in their own way, so they decided they wanted to do this function by function rather than look at their whole business in one go. We looked at the IT function, and we said to them, okay, we're going to profile it. We think the green triangle on the left-hand side here is what our algorithms told us. We said, do you know what? You've got a massive opportunity to outsource your IT function. This isn't, a revelation. That wasn't information they weren't aware of. What they then decided to do as a result of the work that we were doing with them was to actually redraw some of these triangles, if you like. So one of the sort of high-level outputs for them was to redraw their triangles in context of what they were going to do. We showed them that there was a big opportunity for proximity, for automation, and for talent alternatives within their IT function. They then started to use their strategy to describe why they weren't going full tilt on all these things. The reason why proximity is so low in terms of how they want their IT function to be used is because they're actually an organisation that has the country that they're based in the title of the name. They're a patriotic business. They're not looking to outsource to another country. Their version of proximity is 5 locations within country at different price points. What we've allowed them to do is actually now to describe within the plan that they have the reasons why they're very specifically not going to use that lever as a way of changing the work that they do. When we went through this process as well, I'm just going to sort of touch on it. The output from this was a very long list of things which spanned renegotiating contracts with outsourced providers with some of the things that they do through to very specific process automation pilots that they were running. It ran into the hundreds in terms of the interventions and the program of work that they had. But it was a very different way of thinking about it than the traditional way of thinking through, well, let's think about the type of people that we've got. Do I need another 5 of those or do I need another 10? It actually then got down into the type of work, and it drew in people from across the organisation. It drew in operations, it drew in strategy, it drew in IT, as well as HR, who were kind of leading the charge with this piece of work. You finish off, am I? So I think in terms of sort of where we're hitting with this, one of the real, I guess, big things that comes out of this is that we ask more questions than we solve. As people start to go through this process, they start to realise that when you do really specifically target work within a role, that this will impact on an individual, and then you have to start thinking about what you're going to do with that, which is very, very important and very powerful as well. This approach does allow you to start thinking about dealing with roles that don't exist. So you can start to think about roles that you don't have in your business. Again, as I was saying at the beginning, if I could have predicted that social media managers would be the role that every organisation would need 10 years ago, again, I'd probably be a very rich man, but no. But thinking about what that change might mean in terms of the types of skills that would comprise of, or the typical types of work that could be, you can start to build these composites and see how they fit with other roles that you have within your business, within your organisation. You can start to think about how that will transform careers and pathways. Again, if you're thinking about taking pieces of work out as a result of some sort of transformational program, you can start to directly compare other roles, and you can start to give people insight into where they could go or what they could do. You can continuously redesign the roles that you have, and you could start to think about how you move certain work types into an area or certain different types of talent into a space. And actually, this is quite an important one, deliberately thinking about how you're going to engage with some of these things like alternative talent. A lot of people start talking about, well, we want to be the new Uber. Well, chances are you're probably not Uber. But thinking about how you engage with like contingent workforce or a gig platform in a deliberate way that's actually proactively going out and saying, we think that work is at risk. We think that that's got a high opportunity to be changed, and we want to be doing that. So you can quite deliberately think about how you approach this. And then finally, thinking about the leadership and the infrastructure that actually supports that workforce change. As I said, one of the really big things that comes out of this is doing a very, very strategic process where you're thinking about, well, I can cherry pick pieces of work and automate them and replace them or move them around, very quickly drops people right back down to the bottom of the pond. And they start thinking about the individuals who are going to be impacted on this. So it's very important as a tool to actually create the leadership understanding around what this means for the workforce that they have. So I think we're going to close there, but we wanted to open the floor up to questions and see if anyone's got any comments or questions they'd like to have.
Well, first off, let's give him a hand. That's fantastic. I really. I mean that selfishly, because if you were there for the keynote, I was talking about something similar. So call it convergent validity, or patting my fragile ego. A few things are called out for me and on your behalf, because this is actually, show of hands, who regards this as a distinct difference from what you're doing now or your current mandate? So I imagine most of you, right? So what then is going to be the driver of the necessary change so we actually have the mandate to affect change? Because this is a lot of different people in our organization. It's IT, it's procurement, it's digital transformation, it's obviously HR. So how is it going to get done? So I'm going to pose the question to you all in that regard, because I know that the answer isn't there yet. But if we're truly going to affect the change, because robots are going to affect how work gets done, we're going to interact with machines, whether it be on our screens or in 3 dimensions. We're going to work without source providers, globalization, all that. We don't have the governance models in place in most of our organizations to accommodate that reality. So what do you think is going to be the shift to get us to that reality? And if you could answer that in 60 seconds, and right now, just take your time, please.
So I think my reflection on this would be that a lot of the ways in which people are thinking about disruption to their workforce is in a very traditional way. Yep. It's one of the reasons why the customers for this type of thing are IT and ops as well as HR. But they're using very traditional metrics to measure the success of what they're doing. So you bring in an RPA program or an automation program. Automation gets too much airtime. Let's say you bring in a crowdsourcing program. The target that they set within the business cases will be the traditional measures, like an FTE count. We're going to reduce by 10 FTE, or we're going to get this per bot or per whatever you're going to do. But actually, when you start to think about how that's going to impact across the business, that could touch 8, 10 roles. That could touch different parts of the organization. So that sort of salami slicing of what's happening is really where a lot of the people at the front edge of this are thinking, which is you have to think about the way in which you're essentially structuring the programs that you're going for. Yep. What's the opportunity and the benefit? And it's not the traditional business case metrics that you would think of, because they're too blunt.
Right.
And I think there's a bit around stepping back. So one of the things that we're talking about now, and apologies again for the consulting slang, is actually getting organizations to zoom out. So there is so much happening in terms of transformation, so much investment across any given organization that all impacts the workforce in some way. And we've been working with Global Financial Services for a couple of years now, because they put a lot of money into tech transformation around actually stepping back, zooming out, and looking across everything they're doing to realize some alignment and consistency in the transformation and the impact that it has on the workforce, because so much is happening. And it's about bringing it together now so that it actually has the impact that people want it to have.
I think this is a massively important discussion to have in this forum, because what I find, frankly, in people analytics, whether it be in the States or elsewhere, is a lot of organizations, people analytics COEs specifically, are skating or running to where the ball was as opposed to where it's going. And even if we're trying to run to where it's going, we're not running fast enough. We're not taking a good angle. We're chasing consistently. So what I get really excited as an opportunity and really kind of scared on everyone's behalf is that we're not, frankly, in my view, we don't have a clarity of the vision that we are going to play as people analytics professionals. We, in many cases, don't have the creativity to facilitate a coalition that's going to actually bring about this change. And related to that, oftentimes, and I'm speaking generally, of course, we don't have the courage to put ourselves out there to really disrupt the norm. And again, that's not a criticism. It's coming from a place of compassion. So, what are your comments on that? You know, you work with obviously hundreds of companies as a firm and individually. You know, of those who are doing this shift reasonably well, what do you see as being maybe some common denominators? Do they have a more cohesive leadership team who actually is spanning out and making decisions accordingly? I mean, what are some of the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think it is that.
Yeah.
I think it's really challenging the tradition that organisations and particularly things like professions have. And for those of you who are interested, the future of professions is a fascinating topic. But and there's a huge amount of research going on, sort of knowledge-based work and things like that. But breaking the way in which people think about jobs and roles at a leadership level and being comfortable with actually being able to describe how they're going to really significantly change is kind of the first step.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's really
Thank you. We got time for one or two more questions, and there's 3 hands that shoot up. So we'll do 3.
Just really quickly, so I've had on my priority list for this year, and we're already in April, work planning. So deliberately not just workforce planning, but work planning as a priority. And I don't often say this, but I don't know how to just tackle it. It just feels so huge, and everyone keeps saying, well, just do a business unit. Start with that. And I'm thinking, oh, that just feels not ambitious enough for where we need to get to. So any tips? Can you crack it for me in 30 seconds?
Yeah, sure. We can talk after this. I guess there's always the approach with some of this stuff to pilot it. I think depending on how you want to do it, the key to it for us was around thinking about work and the common framework, the common language for it. If you can do that, you can basically do any part of your business. That was really the bit that was the breakthrough for us. And it's kind of one of the annoying if you like, questions that we throw back to organisations. They're like, do we need to do a business unit? And it's kind of like, well, because we've got the framework, you could do anything that you want because you're describing it in the same way.
And I think it's the ability to get your leaders in a room actually making some decisions on it, because I think that stops us from being successful is when you've got real sponsorship from the leadership.
All right, and to be fair, we're going to go there, and I'll come back to you with the final question. Okay, and I'll just say real quickly, I get criticized a lot because given my role, I can stare at the ceiling and do whatever the heck I want. And I realize it's a luxury, and I get criticized for trying to boil the ocean, but merely what I'm trying to do is launch a boat that won't sink. And a lot of times to make this fundamental change has to deal with systematic thinking. It requires a change in IT, data approach, analytics, and so forth. You want to ask your question now, don't you?
No, it's not a question.
Yeah, please.
Over the last couple of months, we've been working on this as well. And what we realized is that our function description is really, this is a language thing as well. Functions are written because we want to make a distinction between one function and the next function. So what we try to do is try to get to the point where we can actually compare stuff. So that's what the big difference between functions and roles was. So we set up a set of roles, and it turns out that once you start looking at roles and the skills you need to do that role, suddenly you see other patterns emerging within the organization. So I would go there if I were you.
Thank you for asserting yourself. Appreciate that. There you go. Thank you.
And I just wanted to add, one of the things we've done is look at our critical roles. So Ofgem, our regulator, has tasked us in workforce planning and said, well, don't worry about the whole organisation. Let's look at the critical roles in engineering. That's really where we've got the demand. So that might be something as well. One of the questions you talked a lot about strategy and linking strategy to the type of work, and we pulled it out in the poll that actually we're good at operational, but we're not very good at the strategic piece, and that's something that we struggle as an organisation, getting our leaders to think strategically, and we might have a strategy in the strategic business plan, but they struggle to actually then articulate what that means for the work. And if we look at a demand driver, well, is it going to double the work that we need, or how's it? So what kind of tips or advice have you seen of how to get organisations to actually apply the strategy to work?
You go.
I think that's where the wargaming piece works quite well. So actually getting people in a room that make decisions around aspects of leadership and getting them to think about the trends bringing in the macro trends, but actually getting them to define the trends that are going to impact their workforce. When we set out doing this, Michael was part of the team that did it. When we talked about this a couple of years ago, we did it to ourselves first and trialed it in the UK and then across Europe. And getting partners in a room actually starting to talk about impacts to the workforce was quite interesting in itself, because the first thing we got was exactly that, was the challenge and the difficulty that they had in thinking about what's the level of automation they're going to need. The answer was, well, how am I supposed to know? But when you bring them into that environment, and we do it in a lab-based environment, and pull out the scenarios and the whole wargaming approach, it makes it a different type of conversation, and it can bring out some really interesting elements to what leaders will put their kind of hat against.
I think it is that part of actually describing what that looks like once you've made this change. So if you're actually thinking about significantly changing or removing or adapting what someone is doing in a role, being able to then actually describe, well, okay, if we change all of this, you don't have that role anymore. So what do I do with that individual? What do I do with that function? Are you comfortable with it being that way? That's another way to kind of engage the leadership in terms of what that looks like, because that's basically their strategy. I'm getting the nod.
A slightly different question is just, how do you enable the trust to let you start pulling the levers once you've done the great work we're describing here? Because organisations sometimes talk around, yep, we want to do the gig economy, yep, we want people working remotely, but then you get managers who, if they can't see the people and the bum's not on the seat, they're not really comfortable with that. And there's sort of a second shift there to, what do we trust the bot to be doing the right thing? Have you got any advice around your experience in that area?
I think in a lot of organisations, the horse has bolted a little bit on some of those programs. So they're sort of doing the planning for this in parallel to doing the pilots, doing the change. And again, that's certainly what we're seeing with a lot of organisations. We're being brought in as part of the pilots. So when they're looking at things like different ways of working or automation, they're saying, actually, we need to take one step back, continue doing what we're doing because we know it's important, we're going to invest in this, we're heavily investing in automation or whatever that thing might be. But we actually now need to look at the opportunity across the rest of the organisation in order for us to understand the impact of that. Yeah. And that essentially starts to bolster the reasons why they're doing it. It's much less about just doing something because we need to pilot this, we need to be keeping up with the competition. And then it starts to become a conversation about how does this become part of the organisation.
And and it's being honest with yourself as well. Like I work with financial services, and the amount of times organisations I work with will say, oh, well, we want to be more like Google, or we want to do X, Y, Z. And it's like, well, you're not. And you probably never will be because of where you're starting and the whole DNA of your organisation. So it's also being honest with the culture and your organisation and what it is that you have today and what you want it to be. And if that is trying to introduce a chatbot or a way of working that works in a tech company, it's probably not going to work in your organization. So it's really knowing what's core and fundamental to the culture that you're establishing.
All right. Well, again, fantastic. Thanks for leading the discussion.